Today we're going to show you how to access the components in a front control Samsung dryer. We'll show you where the most common components are and the easiest way to access them. Although this video shows the general disassembly procedure for this dryer, if you have a specific part that you're looking to replace, simply visit our website and using your model number, search for that part and we may have a specific repair video just for you. Now before we begin the disassembly of this dryer, the first thing you'll need to do is to disconnect the power. So always make sure you either turn off the breaker or unplug the appliance. Our first step will be to remove the main top to access the components in that area. To do so, we need to get to the back of the dryer and remove the retaining screws that secure that top to the cabinet. So just locate the two screws that secure that top and remove them. And we're simply going to grasp both sides of that top, lift that top off, and then we can set that aside. Now with the top removed, we then have access to our main control board located on the side of the cabinet. And as well, we have access to the retaining screws that secure the console to that support bracket. Now to remove that control board, we need to take out these three screws that secure it. We can then pull it away from the cabinet and rotate it around, and that gives us access to all the harnesses that are attached to that control board, as well as the ability to remove the control board from the mounting bracket. Now to remove that console, we'll need to remove these three screws. So simply grasp both sides of that console. Just lift up slightly and rotate it forward. We need to disengage some plastic tabs across the bottom of that console that fit into the top of the front panel. Once we disengage those, we can lay it flat. You'll note the tabs across the bottom of that console, and they fit into these openings in the front of the front panel. And next we'll need to disconnect the wire harnesses that secure the user interface board to the main harness. And pull the two halves of the harness apart. Do the same with the second one. You can now remove that console with the user interface control attached to it. Now our next step will be to remove the door. If you were doing any kind of service on that door, you don't need to remove the whole front panel. You can simply take the door off of that front panel. So to remove that door, all we need to do is take out these two screws that secure the hinge to the front panel. You'll note on the back side of that hinge there is a screw attached. That normally fits into this keyhole slot, drops down into place, and will hold the door from tilting forward while you're removing the retaining screws. Now to remove the front panel on this style of dryer, there are four screws across the top of the front panel that secure to that mounting bracket. But we also have two screws located down near the lint filter area that secure it to the inner bulkhead. So we'll begin by removing these two screws on the bottom. Next we'll do the four screws across the top. Now with the screws removed, we still have a couple of spring clips here at the top that will hold that front panel in place. So we simply need to just lift slightly on that or pry slightly across the top, pull it forward, and that'll give us access to disconnect the harness to the door switch, and then we can lift that panel off. Now with the front panel tilted forward, we expose three little hooks across the base of the dryer frame. We simply need to lift that front panel off and remove it. Now with the front panel removed, we now have access to the door switch. We would simply depress the little locking tab on one side and you can rotate it out through the front. And we'll also show you the latch assembly for that dryer, although you don't need to remove the front panel to replace it, It's simply held in place with 2 screws. You can remove those and change out that part. Now with the front panel removed, we have access to our heating components, a harness for our dryness sensor. To get better access, we'll need to remove this cover as part of the air inlet to the blower assembly. Now the screws that secure that duct assembly to the bulkhead, there are 3 of them, one on the right hand side, one exactly opposite on the left, and then another one down on the front of the blower housing. Before we can remove that, we'll need to pull the lint screen out, and then the 3 screws. And just tilt it out on the bottom, allow it to drop down, and then you can remove that. Now with that air duct removed, you now have access to our blower wheel. You can inspect that for any damage or any items that may be caught in that area. If you need to replace that, you'll need to remove this shroud across the front of it. It's held in place with 2 screws. Now to gain access to the internal components in that dryer cabinet, we'll need to remove the front bulkhead. Before we do that, we need to disconnect a couple of wire harnesses. One down below here that goes through the dryer sensor, and there's also one that attaches to the drum light at the top right hand corner. Simply pull the harness connector off of the socket and release the harness clip. There's another one in behind that we'll be able to access once we lift that bulkhead away. Now with the harness connector for the dryness sensor, we need to release that locking tab and then pull the harness connector apart, and now we're ready to remove the mounting screws. So there's 4 screws, 1 in each corner. Now, even though we've removed the screws, there are keyhole slots and tabs that drop down into those that will hold that front bulkhead in place. Now with the 4 screws removed that secure the bulkhead to the cabinet, we'll also need to remove this upper bracket. It makes removing that bulkhead much easier. So there are 2 screws on either side, one on the front, one up at the top. We simply need to remove those and lift that bracket out of the way. Then we're just going to lift up on that support bracket, disengage it from the top of that bulkhead through that slot, and then we can just set that aside. Now next we'll release the harness from these straps, and then we can lay that out of the way. And now we're ready to lift that bulkhead off. Because we have the tension of the belt on the drum pressing down on that, you'll have to lift up rather sharply to release those tabs on the sides. Now with it released from the tabs, we can just lower it down. Now with that bulkhead completely removed, we then have access to the front drum rollers. To replace those, we would simply pry off this little triangular shaped clip. Now we do have access to the heater housing at this point. We simply need to remove the 1 retaining screw in the front. Now next we'll need to lift up on that bracket. It's usually in there quite tight, so take a stiff putty knife or a flat blade screwdriver and go in this area and just pry upwards on it. You may need to lift up on the drum at the same time. That will release that tab. You can then pull that whole assembly out through the front. We now have access to our high limit thermostat, our thermal cutoff, heating element assembly itself. Now to gain access to the idler and motor, we'll need to remove the drum. To do that, we need to release the tension of the belt on the idler. So reaching in on both the left and through the center, we'll locate the belt, follow that down to the idler assembly. We're just going to push or pull that over to the left. That will release the tension on the belt. And we can roll it off of the motor pulley. Slowly release the tension on that idler spring. Now with the belt released from the motor and idler, we can then use it to lift that drum off the rear drum rollers and pull it out through the front of the cabinet. Now at this point we can either replace that belt, and we also have access to both our rear and front drum seals should they need to be replaced. Now with the drum removed, we then have access to our thermal cutout that is mounted on the side of that blower housing, our thermistor or temperature sensor, again located on that blower housing. We have access to our drive motor, our idler assembly, and in behind the motor we have access to our broken belt switch. On the rear bulkhead, we have access to our rear drum rollers. Thank you so much for watching. We certainly hope that this video was helpful to you. And be sure to subscribe so you don't miss a thing.